Welcome, everyone. My name is Charu, S. Charu Sheila, and I'm going to open this proceeding with a little bit of background on what this event, this seminar series is, and some thanks, and explain the context, and then we'll take it from there. So first, a very special thanks to the Harry Bridges Labor Center and to the University of Washington Bothell School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences and UW Bothell Labor Group for hosting this series. This particular seminar series is a series of 4 lectures, which we are now dedicating in memory of Drew Barker, Drusilla K. Barker, our dear, dear friend and colleague who we lost just this weekend. This lecture series got its conception 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago. It started with a kernel of ideas that were done by Jennifer Cohen, Sirisha, Smita, Smriti, who had formed a kernel of colleagues who were working on feminist radical political economy. And we're really rethinking social reproduction in a new way, thinking about it much more broadly, much more structurally, integrating questions of race, nation, structure, migration into the politics of this. Very generously, they invited us, many of us, to join. We did. And in particular, when COVID started, we felt a need to have an intellectual community, given that conferences where we often met were no longer there in person in the same way. And Drew was instrumental in really gathering us, in helping us form a community, in listening to our work, in workshopping our ideas. And a very special shout out to Chingy Chen, in particular, my colleague in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences. They were coordinating the labor series 2 years ago, and they invited us to present. So the first presentation of this project was one seminar with all of us 2 years ago. And I was nervous, I will be honest. They're interdisciplinary, but I was still thinking feminist economists, creative writing. And Drew is the person who said, well, of course, they're interdisciplinary. There are so many ways in which we can imagine our futures and think about analysis. Some is data, some is social science. That's what many of us are experts at. Some is creative, some is imaginative. And if we don't step in and be willing to do that, who would? And Drew really encouraged us, and we did. Chingy opened her creative writing class, and that was the first presentation of this group on social reproduction revisited, rethought. We presented collectively to Chingy's class. And then this project continued, and we decided we really wanted to expand its ideas. Each of us had something to contribute. We had actually planned out this whole quarter. I want to thank both my school, Harry Bridges Labor Center, and especially my students in the seminar, Gender and the Politics of Numbers, where we are looking at the way numbers and data get used in various ways. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I frame the speakers as we go through the talks. But Drew was going to participate in this. She was going to present in this. We have this desire that we would all convene in May here at University of Washington, or else in South Africa, Cape Town, at IAFI, and maybe workshop this into a book. I hope we still can. We miss her, but it therefore seems right that this project she's been part of for 3 years is where we remember her, and we rename this as the Drusilla K. Barker Memorial Seminar Series. I'll talk more about the series as we go on, but before we go any further, two things. I'm first going to introduce Edith Kuiper, but I'm also going to ask Sophie. I want to thank you, Sophie. I'll do that more later, Sophie in Atlanta. But Sophie, if you can send to the whole group a link to the Padlet. So given that this is a seminar associated with a class, our time for in-person gathering of memories is less, but we have created a space where you can upload memories and images. So Sophie, if you can just stick that in the chat so people can go ahead and post their memories there. Without further ado, I want to now introduce Edith Kuiper. She's the chair of the economics department, SUNY New Paltz. She is also one of the founding members, early members of the International Association for Feminist Economics. And of course, she was the co-editor with Drew of the path-breaking book Toward Feminist Philosophy of Economics. Longtime collaborator, longtime scholar. And Edith is going to now share some memories of Drew. Edith.
Myself. So good evening, everybody. Thank you, Charu, for renaming this series, and it's really great to hear the role that Drew has played in this. So for everybody present, I was asked to tell you a bit about Drew, some stories, some history, and also because I have worked with Drew closely and I have known her. She's a really good friend of mine. So most of you know her in one way or another. You worked with her, you joined her in sessions, but I understand there are also students present here who may not know her personally. So I thought I might start with what you already mentioned, Charu, is that Drew was a founding member of the International Association of Feminist Economics. So she was there from the very, very beginning at the first meeting in New Orleans in 1992. And she has been an active participant of the organization ever since. She chaired, for instance, a few years ago, the governance committee. I didn't know, Charu, if you were part of that, but quite a few people were. It was a result of a heated discussion within IAFI to make IAFI more accessible and democratic, if I remember correctly. And Drew was able to chair that, bring various voices together in a constructive proposal. So, and that was fairly recently. And I'm happy to hear about this initiative that she's been working with you since, which I kind of picked up on, but did not know the whole story of. One thing I thought I'd remember particularly was that Drew was the person who came up with the idea for the IFA pre-conference. So there was something Drew and I talked about, and I remember clearly, and I do not have a very good memory, so that kind of stands out. Drew and me walking back and forth on a marshalling yard close to a train station, and we had to wait on the bus, and the bus wasn't coming. So we got all the ideas flowing, and we were concerned about young people having difficulty coming into IAFI. And Drew said, okay, what we need is an extra day of conference to introduce young people and newcomers to the field. Okay, so that was what we organized, right? We did this with Ingrid Robijns. First pre-conference was in Washington. If I remember correctly, I would have to check that, but it's kind of, I recognize that when Charu tells us about how Drew kind of helped you to concretize things, right? To really get them organized and get them running. So that is definitely how I also remember Drew. I met Drew for the first time in the late 90s, and on a later IFE conference, we talked epistemology, because that interested us very much. We were very committed and involved in the topic. And then she told me about a book that she was working on. She had a lot of materials. It took time to finish. She was a bit stuck, and we talked more and decided to finish the book together. So Andrew was great to work with. As you may know, most of you do, is that it's very difficult to find a co-author, or in this case, a co-editor that you can really work with, that you can trust and just make something together, because everybody has their specific ways, but we were very lucky to have found each other. She's a hard worker. She has really strong and supportive input, which was important for me. And she was very committed to the topic. She really wanted to figure out what was going on. I don't recall, and I think that's the special thing with edited volumes, is that we had difficulty with getting the final papers in. We may have had to pursue some people, but they were all coming in. So that was towards the feminist philosophy of economics, and we were both very happy with that book. So that was 2003, and soon after we talked more, and then decided on a next project. That was a set of sessions that we organized about the World Bank report Engendering Development, what had just come out in 2001. And we wanted to discuss that, to analyze what kind of report is this, what does it mean, what does it do, what does it stand for? And we had these sessions at Barbados IFE conference. So 2 sessions, 4 papers, discussions, and that kind of, the book came out of that. So same thing is, I don't recall any difficulty with pulling it off. So that kind of it came about more or less by itself. Soon after, Drew was asked to bring together a collection of seminal or central feminist economic texts. Okay, that is a difficult endeavor, because then you kind of claim to, or that's what you do, to define the field, right? You decide on what are central economic texts. I would take care of the first volume on the historical text, and then Drew would do the second, third, and fourth volume on the text in various subfields of feminist economics. So what we did, and I remember that very vividly, is we presented a list of content. So the list of content, which articles we plan to invite, select, put into the volume, and why, at the IFE conference in Torino. Oh man, so we got some serious pushback on that. And what was Rosa Luxemburg doing in this volume? And I remember C.C. Conrad, who was really vocal, and she said, there are articles of contribution of women of color, and I were really grateful, and we included most of the comments and suggestions, which really improved the contents of these volumes. So, but later, Drew and I published 2 chapters, one in the Handbook of Feminist Philosophy of Science, other in Feminist Theory. And that was, again, something different, because then we wrote together. So we had an argument, and we elaborated that, we rearranged it, we further developed it, and it was just wonderful. So we both learned, and we changed our mind, and until we were happy with what was. Okay, so I was traveling over there a lot, and would stay for a month in the country, and Drew visited me. So she visited me in Florence at the European University Institute, and we actually gave a talk there together, and visited me in Sardinia, where I was on invitation of Elizabeth Addis. Some may remember her, and who had a house in Sardinia. And Drew and I just, played the tourist, and we visited Nulages, if that rings a bell at all for you. We went to see Corsica, which is wonderful. When I moved to Newport, I invited Drew to contribute to a conference about intersectionality in feminist economics, and Drew chaired the whole thing. So later students would tell me they were amazed about this Professor Trubaka, who's that, right? And they were really amazed by her input, by her presence. It was really good to see Drew shine and students picking up on her person. Drew was just always searching for what is going on, what do I want to be involved in, and how can I move things further. Always cutting edge. Her interest in writing on unpaid care work, on epistemology, on globalization. She made linkages that were innovative and amazing. She thought about that before a whole lot of people did that. It was a new topic for her. She tackled it. She was a strong writer and very important to me. She was a great mentor, supportive. You could trust her, and her critique was always constructive. So what I noticed, and you also have noticed that over time, she became more critical of Ayafi and of the journal Feminist Economics. She did not feel that her ideas were reflected in that it fed her, but she remained active in Ayafi and spoke up. So she had that loyalty and commitment. She was, and she told me that, I picked up on that, she was very enthusiastic about people in rethinking Marxism. And more recently, about this new group of feminist radicalists, you call them political economists, right? So she got on the board of the editorial board of Rethinking Marxism, and what Suzanne Busseron told me, on the steering committee of the Association for Social and Economic Analysis. And I understand that most of you are connected to that. So group with you to get a seminar series organized, and she was on the schedule to talk. So she wanted to be here. Well, I wish you success with the seminar series, and I hope Drew will inspire you during these 4 seminars and in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edith. This memory speaks to so many of us, because the kind of careful, detailed presence that you're describing in your collaborations with Drew is what so many of us have experienced with her. You had mentioned rethinking Marxism. I will make sure that we already sent the Padlet, but I will also make sure that our website includes the additional WordPress site that Rethinking Marxism has put together for people to do memorials for Drew. And eventually they're going to actually collate both those sites. So it doesn't matter where you present your memory, they will all be collated together. Because, you know, Drew was so much part of so many communities. And that's why it takes 4 seminars, because each community deserves its presence. She was part of IAFI. She was part of Rethinking Marxism and the Association for Economic and Social Analysis. Hopefully, Jennifer, maybe Jen Cohen, when you talk, you can update us on this. We know she was active in Union for Radical Political Economy, and there's a special issue where, in fact, one of her final papers, Speaking Truth to Power, was due to be published in the special issue soon, and it should hopefully be available for public free access for a while. They're working on that with RRP. She was also very active in National Women's Studies Association. She was active with International Political Economy and sort of the project on feminist IPE. She was also active in FEMS, Feminist Epistemology, Methodology, Science Studies. This is just one sign of the sheer interdisciplinarity and presence that Drew had. So many academic communities, political science, women's studies, economics, science studies, philosophy. To me, that's why she is the person who told me, well, obviously, if you're in an interdisciplinary school and it's going to be a course on literature, we have to be there. So that was true. We're going to have 3 more sessions. Each session will have its own new memory of Drew. But now for people joining us, do please look at the Padlet. Do please look at additional updates on the websites where you can post your memories. But this is actually a seminar series that is attached to the course Gender and the Politics of Numbers, one that Drew helped conceive, and one that we worked hard to attach the seminar series to. So a little bit about the class and a little bit about our structure before I introduce our speakers and we move from there. So first and foremost, this class is called Gender and the Politics of Numbers. It's an interdisciplinary class. It's cross-listed senior undergraduates and graduate students. And it's been designed to work with students in a variety of disciplines: law, economics, public policy, global studies, gender, women, sexuality studies, but also mathematical thinking and data visualization. Also, students who come from technical backgrounds in math and stats, who are trying to understand the politics of the numbers they use. So if on the one hand, we enter this world thinking that data matters, on the other hand, we need to enter this world understanding what the data is, how it's collected, and how it's used. So I want to first start with a very special thank you to Associate Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Education, Cinnamon Hilliard, also my colleague and mathematician who helped me develop this class. Mathematical thinking, data visualization is not something I thought I would design my class around. But as a mathematical educator and mathematician, Cinnamon really helped me envision this class. So it comes with 6 units: the history of statistics, the current unit, which should be familiar for many feminist scholars, is the politics of numbers around what do we count, what's invisible, but also what's hypervisible, something that feminists don't, inside econ, we're so focused on invisible labor, we don't often realize that questions of intersectionality are also questions of hypervisibility. So invisibility, hypervisibility, what do we count, what do we not count? And today's discussion surrounds health, invisibility, visibility, labor, interpretation of data, people's labor, what's recognized, what's not recognized, and what do we have to understand in order not just to have numbers, but to interpret numbers, because that's a crucial part of this class. How do you get the numbers? How do you interpret them? Additional units as we go on will include units on interpretation using models. We're going to look at neoclassical game theory and other models, but it's the way in which abstract modeling shapes interpretation. A further unit's going to be on spurious interpretations of data, the way in which biases around things like why do women earn less, does this work count, and so on, enter into interpretations. And then they're going to go further on into econometrics and additional ways to interpret numbers. And at the and students have their own projects. So it's really a politics of numbers, starting with what we count, how we interpret it, how do we understand what's going on, and then moving through to, okay, now that we've got there, how do we rate, how do we rank, how do we assess, how do we interpret, how do we assess causality? So that's the structure of the class. It's not a classic economics class. It's really a math, data, gender interpretation class, but econ is our anchor. And to me, this is so much true, because Drew's idea of economics was the philosophy that didn't just say we were economists, but which asked us, how are you doing this? Why are you doing this? What are your assumptions? What are you going to do with these numbers? How are you going to interpret them? What are you counting? What are you not counting? And to me, Edith, you mentioned the Engendering Development Report. I actually contributed to that volume, and I was invited by you. And I remember so clearly that part of that project was, okay, World Bank has decided women matter. And they now have a whole report on how women matter. And they're now going to develop all around women. And the question was, okay, so what are they doing? Why are they doing it? How are they doing it? What are they counting? What's working? What's not working? This is so much true. So for me, this is the perfect class in which we anchor this. We have 8 speakers over the series. Today's 2 speakers are Jennifer Cohen and Sirisha Naidu. For people joining us, the students in this class have read work by both Jennifer and Sirisha. So some of this reflects the fact that they've done readings. But of course, we understand that we have visitors here. The way we're going to do this is Jennifer is going to present first, then Sirisha. It is about labor, health, but it's also about visibility, invisibility, interpretation. There's only so much you can cover in a public lecture. The way we're going to do this, they're going to do their lectures. Then the first group that's going to be asked to present their questions is the students in the class. So gender and politics of numbers students, when we open for questions, we're going to ask you to put your question in the chat. I know many of you submitted it on Canvas, but there were a lot of questions. So we have to curate it. 14 students, 28 questions. We can't obviously cover everything, but post the questions, especially because some of your questions will be updated in light of the presentation. We'll start with the students, and then after the students are done, we'll open it up to the public. And again, if you are here for Drew, this is very much dedicated to Drew. Please check the Padlet and please look for the spaces where you can post images and memories for her. Thank you. So without further ado, Jennifer Cohen is our first speaker. Sirisha Naidu is our second. I'm going to start with Jennifer. If you look at the publicity, you will see her bio. So I won't replicate that. I just want to note, Jennifer, I met in an IAFI conference. We were actually waiting for the bus to go to one of the sessions. And you see people in the same sessions as you. And you're like, oh, they like the same work I do. And that's how I met Jennifer. We became friends through that. We actually, even though we actually went to UMass, we didn't overlap. So that's not where we met at all. We met through IAFI, that we had different advisors and things like that. And Jennifer, I particularly owe a thanks to, because she was one of the original conveners for Feminist Radical Political Economy, the group of us who, with Drew's support and mentorship, were really putting forward this project. Jennifer.
Thank you, Charu. Let's see. I have a couple of little announcements. The first one is that I'm going to present in my little window. So if you don't have it in speaker view, you should go up to the top right corner into view and change from gallery to speaker. And you might want to pin me so that you can actually see the whole presentation. The other thing that I wanted to mention, this is a Prezi presentation, so it's going to do some moving around like that. If that bothers you, there's a link in the chat to a PDF of the presentation that's on my website that should just take you straight to the PDF. I sent that link to a couple of people. Okay, cool. So I didn't realize that everyone had fully read all of the pieces beforehand. So some of this might be a bit repetitive, but I was also thinking about that, about the sheer number of times that I've talked about it and worked on it, and how I always learn more every time. And also that means I can go through a little bit quickly, which will be a good thing too. A little bit of background on me. I'm an associate professor. I'm in international studies, women, gender, sexuality studies, critical race and ethnic studies, and global and intercultural studies at Miami. And my background is completely interdisciplinary. Economics is my PhD, but I have a master's degree in political science and undergrad degrees in sociology and geography. And I use qualitative and quantitative methods in my research, which is one of the things that I wanted to mention. I do work largely on healthcare workers, starting with nurses in South Africa, but I just started a new big project with direct support professionals in New York State. That's going to be an optimistically 8,000 person survey where we're going to do intersectional analysis. So I'm really stoked actually that your class is set up the way it is. The politics of numbers is certainly an interesting avenue for going into these things. Okay, so I'm going to talk about stuff from the thing that you read, which is capitalism and work and health. And really what I'm looking at is the gendered and racialized labor that people do and how production and reproduction are structured. So I actually am drawing from Drew on this first slide here. So one of the key points that Drew makes and then I make, and that is there throughout at least the one paper with Yana, is that the organization of production and reproduction shapes people's lives really fundamentally. It restructures families, it changes families' economic lives. It doesn't do that alone, and it's not the only thing that impacts people's lives. But you know, what Drew talks about in the piece that I'm not sure if you read that she talks about the move from feudalism to capitalism and how dramatic that change was for people and how violent. And she makes an important point there, which is that this isn't just about a change in production and reproduction. It's also about changes in power and culture and ideology and norms, right? So those other things that are dynamic also. So a little bit of background on just like, I'm going to do a little bit of that background on capitalism in general, and then pandemics in general, and then talk about COVID. So the capitalism in general material, when I talk about capital accumulation, I'm roughly talking about what most people mean when they talk about economic growth. Right? So this is the accumulation of capital by profitable organizations, effectively. The other main point of the key point of that still in capital accumulation is that the motor of capitalism is the profit motive that incentivizes profit maximization and cost minimization practices. And that means that business owners want to decrease, for example, labor costs. And this gets to the second point here, which is that the capitalist organization of production and reproduction combined with structures of oppression, like white supremacy, to create and reinforce the vulnerability of racialized and gendered populations. So the link between those first two is that if a business owner wants to minimize their costs, then they might want to hire workers that are in other ways stigmatized in labor markets and get paid less, right? So the capitalist organization of work is significantly about using oppression along with exploitation to widen profits as much as possible and to minimize costs. The other point that I've got on here is that the capitalist organization of production and reproduction sort of necessarily requires really the rapid circulation of people, products, and pathogens across long distances, and in some cases through exploitative processes that are associated with capital accumulation. One of them is colonization, but I will talk about more of them momentarily. So the sort of general stuff on pandemics and capitalism, this is just a really fascinating history. The viral transmission in the history of pandemics and in COVID really show how the gender and race divisions of labor and organization of work are key social determinants of health. And I think that might be one of the things that really wasn't in the paper. So let me elaborate on what social determinants of health are a little bit. So social determinants of health are called by the World Health Organization the main determinants of health. There are different estimates of how much of one's health they determine that range basically from about 40% to 80%. Social determinants of health include things like the kind of work that you do. So occupational health is part of what I'm interested in. And there I'm looking, roughly what people would look at would be, like workplace injuries and things like that, right? So their health depends on the kind of work that they do. I study that with precarious work and anxiety, which is some of the work that I'm doing with the direct support professionals in New York. The social part of social determinants of health means that they're not genetic, right? They're not genetic causes. These aren't like things that people were born with. So exposure to things like pollutants that can cause asthma, right? That's a social determinant of health. Right? The pollution is a social determinant of health. The asthma is the health outcome. So social determinants of health are major determinants of health, and work is one of the biggest ones. The history of the pandemics really is just absolutely fascinating to look at how much more rapidly they spread over time. It's really a function of capitalist development. So 1830, there was an influenza pandemic. It took a year to reach around the world. By 1899, there was another influenza pandemic. That took a matter of months to get from Russia to the US. And it happened through the work that people do and through railroads and steamships. Right, so the change in transportation technology is what increasingly rapidly moves people and products and pathogens around the world. So we didn't really have pandemics of the variety that we've had now until fairly recently, once you could fly around. There's no controlling that kind of transmission then. The other aspect of this is that capitalist development processes themselves make pandemics more likely. And those processes include factory production, urbanization, overcrowding, deforestation, industrial farming, climate change. Right? All of those things are development processes that we associate, at least now in our existing economy, with capitalism. Deforestation was a part of the COVID pandemic, but we could talk more about each of those if people are interested. So talking about COVID, now, when we think about COVID, there's a big question about whether we're talking about COVID, the pandemic, or COVID, a virus, right? So COVID is the sort of social phenomenon that results in these health outcomes, but the SARS-CoV-2 virus is the actual virus. So normally what people are talking about is COVID. They're not really talking about the virus, but a lot of people conflate the two and think that they are. It's not the virus that caused the spread the way that we see it, right? The way that we see the spread of the virus itself is through the capitalist organization of work, right? So I said that exploitation is combined with structures of oppression and creates these vulnerable, racialized, and gendered populations. They're the same groups that are worst impacted by COVID. Totally predictable might be a bit of an exaggeration, but once we were aware of how COVID spread, the way that it spread across different demographic groups was totally predictable because of the way that work is organized and because of the way that segregation puts people into specific kinds of occupations. So in terms of pre-COVID context, this is just like, what was the state of capitalism before this? We were already in a situation where capitalism was, where businesses were combining exploitation and oppression in the interest of cost minimization and profit maximization. And we were already in a place where capitalist economic development had set up conditions that make pandemics more likely. There's a little bit more detail about those at the bottom of that slide. So there are a lot of impacts that COVID has had on women. This is in no way even a remotely exhaustive list. There are only two of them that I'm going to talk about. The first one is that there are massive job losses where women were concentrated. So women are disproportionately concentrated in certain kinds of work, partly because of gender. and occupational segregation. Historically, there are many occupations that weren't open to women. There was resistance to women entering higher education. There were giant protests of male students in England trying to keep women from being able to go to Oxford and Cambridge were the first ones, but to go to school and actually be able to get degrees. And I think the last one of those that really had some serious resistance to it, I believe, was Princeton, and that was only about 70 years ago. So women are concentrated in certain jobs because they didn't have access to other ones, for one thing. But they're also concentrated in certain jobs because of gender norms and social norms around what kind of work is deemed appropriate for women. So women are concentrated in jobs where there were massive job losses. They were also concentrated in essential jobs, frontline jobs. So we'll come back to that in a minute. When we think about profit seeking, I think most people imagine large corporations, and during COVID, Amazon is an obvious example of having massive profits during that. But the second piece that you read for me was this price gougers, hoarders piece. I really did want to get to talk about this one because this was one of Drew's favorite things that I've written, which made me very happy because it was a really fun thing to write. So you have this jump in demand in early 2020 for PPE, toilet paper, bleach, all of those kinds of things that we all remember now. That jump in demand incentivizes people who want to profit seek through hoarding and price gouging. And those things are very compatible. Obviously, if you're hoarding things, then you can charge higher prices for them. So often people are both hoarders and price gougers at the same time. That hoarding that happened contributed to a shortage of personal protective equipment for healthcare workers who are disproportionately women. And so there are a couple of ways of thinking about this. In the same way that people talked about the pandemic as something that sort of like happened to the economy or society as if it came out of some kind of exogenous, like, it was a shock. The argument that I'm making there is that it was internal to capitalism, right? And so a similar framing of these entrepreneurs that were hoarders and price gougers is that, there's just one or two bad apples and everyone knows that like people shouldn't be doing this. So, are they just bad apples, or, are they jerks or sociopaths, or are they just being entrepreneurs following the profit motive like other businesses? And so that's what that second article is getting at, is basically saying that they're following the same profit motive as any other business is. They're going about it slightly differently though. So this hand sanitizer story was really fascinating. I came across these completely separately. The one is a student who is selling squirts of hand sanitizer for 50 pence in his classroom in England. And the other one was a guy, two brothers actually, that were hoarding hand sanitizer in the US. So this kid, I think he was between like 10 and 12, his dad called him once the story broke to tell him that he was a fucking legend. And these commenters in these articles, and this was like The Guardian, but it was also on HuffPo and stuff, were saying that give him 10 years and he'll be a great businessman who understands supply and demand. And just in general, commenters were overwhelmingly of the opinion that this kid should be commended for his entrepreneurial genius, right? At the same time, like literally in the same moments, the other page of these news articles was talking about how people were dying from COVID and stores had shortages of hand sanitizer, partly because of hoarding and price gouging. So what we see there is that profit seeking itself still wins plaudits, even while it's actually causing death. So, we might ask ourselves whether profit seeking is something to applaud or punish in this kind of situation. There's this strange ambiguity that comes out of this because it's during a pandemic. But the tension that's really happening there is between the ideology of entrepreneurialism that people internalize under a capitalist ideology, really, and the reality that they're sitting there themselves seeing. So this leads to a kind of cognitive dissonance where people are, saying like, we should applaud this kid. He's gonna do great, exploiting people later. And then the reaction to Matt Colvin, who was this other guy in the US who had hoarded 18,000 bottles of hand sanitizer. The reactions to him doing that hoarding and price gouging were not so positive. They shamed him, and the articles were pretty entertaining about this. Some of them are linked. The question though is really like, why is the reaction so different, right? I mean, these are both people that are price gouging and profiting from, a terrible situation, while people are also dying from the thing that they have been hoarding, not having the thing they've been hoarding. So, what's the difference between that kind of profiteering and regular profiting? Like, where does this sort of cognitive dissonance come from? And I have two answers to that both have to do with visibility. The first is the invisibility of interdependency and consequent invisibilization of women and the work that they do. The other one is the invisibility of exploitation and injustice in the sphere of consumption rather than in the sphere of production, which is where we're used to it taking place. So here's the interdependence one. There's an ideology of this where the entrepreneur is like the self-made man at his self-made manliness and bootstraps and all of that, born alone, die alone. But of course, no one's born alone. Hopefully people don't die alone. People are produced, right? So they're produced physiologically through women's labor, as in going into labor. That the language there is not a coincidence. And the effortful ongoing activity that's disproportionately done by women that we call reproductive labor or social reproduction. The point of this slide and of that argument is not in any way to suggest that men and their activities have nothing to do with that process. Obviously they do. The point is that societies rely on women and their labor in fundamental ways. And those ways are erased by and erased in this mythology of the self-made man. Right? So that kind of mythology is an ideological twist that introduces cognitive dissonance in this sense, or in this instance, is also something that makes women's work invisible. But at the same time with the pandemic, it was interdependency that became more obvious to everybody because the public nature of public health means that we are all interrelated, right? And really the outcome of that is that health is a public good, which is something else we could talk about later if people are interested in. So the second piece of that is the in or visibility of exploitation and injustice. And the way that I sort of explained that already is that the injustice that we're used to is sort of invisible to us because that's the exploitation that happens in production. And because we grow up in capitalist economies, people don't really question whether or not they have the option to work, right? It's an accepted thing that they're going to be involved in this exploitative process of doing paid work. More recently, that has been critiqued more widely, but usually people think in terms of having a choice about what kind of job they're going to do if they're lucky, not about whether they're going to work or not, right? So that kind of exploitation is invisible, partly because people don't want to think about it because they know that they're going to be part of it. Price gouging during disasters makes the injustice more visible. So this guy, Matt Colvin, was making $100,000 a year by buying things and then just reselling them. One of the interviews says that he clearly never thought about what his job was that he was earning that money from. So initially he's framing this in this interview as like a private service for other people. And then he argues, no, he's actually doing a public service that has public benefits. Regarding public health, this is clearly not the case. There are obviously public costs. This is a question that I think is still a pretty salient one. Who should have access to hand sanitizer? Who should have the best access to that? Who should have the best access to inputs to health? I'll be curious what people have to say about that. These stories are tempting to laugh at and just look at like these, you know, amusing stories of entrepreneurialism or whatever. But they're really not. They're really warnings. The first warning is that capitalism grows capitalists, from children to adults who seek to profit from human suffering, and that when they're children, adults are really all behind that. Right? I mean, that's what's happening when they're applauding this kid and saying that he's going to be a great capitalist someday. The other piece of this, though, is that the stories are about societal values, and the pandemic revealed that those values are gendered and racialized matters of life and death in much starker terms than usual. The way that those things are matters of life and death is through occupational segregation and social norms, where women are clustered into certain occupations. Inputs to health should probably be held onto by the people who need them most, who are the most vulnerable in terms of their health. When you have this hoarding and price gouging kind of phenomenon for things that impact public health, it's women, and especially women of color, that are put in harm's way, partly because of the way that those occupations, that people are concentrated in specific occupations. This is true through paid work, when we think about medical. It's also true in reproductive activities that are undertaken in households where, you know, women are exposed to the virus because they're taking care of sick relatives, for example. Who cares about these kinds of issues, and who cares about doing this work, and who actually does the work? It's mostly women. So COVID caused job losses, but we also said that women were essential workers. Women are almost 40% of the global labor force, but they're 54% of workers in hotel and food services. They're concentrated in service industries that are basically doing some kind of reproductive labor. 64% of essential and frontline workers in the US are women. People of color are 37% of the workforce in the US, but 41% of frontline workers, which means that they're overrepresented. In terms of nursing, globally, 85% of nurses are women. In the US, that's 90%. 75% of workers in the health and social sector are women globally. In the US, that's 75%. 45% of whom are women of color, 22% are Black women. So women and people of color have more exposure to COVID because of the jobs that they do. One of the pieces of this that I wanted to mention is that 3 of the most common jobs held by Black women are in nursing. And women are the vast majority of nurses, 90%. Yet PPE, the personal protective equipment, is still designed for men. So women are often in hospitals working with oversized gloves and oversized masks and goggles that don't actually fit them. So they're exposed to more occupational risk, partly because hospitals are unwilling to spend money on those things. So that means that the under-provision of PPE in a hospital has racialized and gendered impacts on people. So you can have something that seems to be like a sort of neutral model of purchasing or budgetary model, but does not have gender neutral outcomes. And that's clearly one of those. So people are concentrated in these jobs. Why they do those jobs would be a whole other extra hour-long thing for us to talk about, or an entire course for a semester. This is my last one, so I will wrap up with this. Capitalism depends on women's reproductive labor to make laborers, right? I mean, that's the intergenerational aspect of this, but also to reproduce people's labor power on a day-to-day basis. Women's paid work that is what disproportionately sustains life, for example, through health. So the implication of this is that the stability of capitalist economies really depends on women's health and women's ability to cope with the demands of their paid work in what are often feminized, devalued jobs, and to cope with the demands of unpaid work in the household. This reliance of the capitalist economic system on women's health and labor suggests that there's some structural fragility, systemic fragility, at the level of social reproduction and societal reproduction. So the ultimate conclusion of this is really that the requirements for social reproduction, which include things like reasonable access to inputs to health, are contradictory to the requirements for capital accumulation and the compelled aspects of that, including cost minimization. which lead to the kind of occupational segregation that we see, as well as, for example, spending less on PPE and putting women disproportionately at risk. So I will stop there and look forward to questions.
Hello, everyone. Me again. Oh my God, thank you, Jennifer. This was so wonderful. We're going to hold on questions. I have so many. I know my students do. If you have questions, please place them in the chat to Sophie, who's going to send them to us. But as you can see, this is a very rich series. All the talks are going to be this rich. Here you can see how questions of visibility, invisibility, gendered labor impact questions of life and death, questions of how we sustain ourselves, questions of who we think is contributing or not, lots of questions. We're going to come back to that. But before we go there, Sirisha Naidu. So Sirisha is also someone I met through IAFE. She is a UMass grad, but actually not Econ Direct. She is someone I met through UMKC and through IAFE. She is, her background is agricultural and social economics. She is now a grad director, UMKC, and a dear colleague. And she has been doing a lot of work on visibility and invisibility, agriculture. The link to health is because the ways in which COVID has impacted migrant workers. But since our class is about visibility, invisibility, the two articles they read, one was a data-based one on visibility and invisibility in the data with Smriti Rao, who we will hear from later on. The second was the impact and implications of these kinds of visibilities and invisibilities, especially for what was one of the largest migrations, internal migrations, COVID related, but just globally internal to India, when migrant workers moved as a result of COVID. So I just want to remind people that this class has a global traverse, and we're looking at specific issues of data, but we're also reminding ourselves that migration, some of the biggest ones, going back all the way to one of the biggest migrations in the United States, which was an internal migration of Blacks after like 1920s, all the way to today, where some of the biggest migrations are internal as well as cross-border. Sirisha.
Thanks, Charu, and thanks, Jen, for framing some of the larger issues, but also kind of giving me a segue into what I want to talk about. I am not able to share what I want to share. Okay, but let me just start talking about it anyway, because I know that we're running out of time, and I'll pull up and hopefully Charu or Sophie will get it soon enough, and we will be able to see the slides as well. Okay, so I've titled this presentation as Reproductive Labor in Times of Crises. And first I want to, yes, Drew, I just want to say a word about Drew because I just met her in November 2022. And so it feels like quite a shock. I mean, I just met with her and we talked and, we had some very interesting and rich conversations. And thank you, Charu, for organizing this and for Suzanne and Edith and, so many of you who have made this path available to us so we don't have to fight as hard. And I know that you've had many, many challenges and struggles to make things easier for some of us who have come after you. So in terms of the questions that I actually want you to consider are sort of related to the politics of visibility, invisibility, and hypervisibility. And there's a lot to talk about. So I'm going to draw a lot from various articles that I've written and work that I've been doing, which is on the issue of social reproduction. So I want you to consider about who and what kinds of work activities are excluded from official statistics, and then how does this exclusion impact our collective perception and understanding of work? And then finally, what are the politics of visibility and hypervisibility, but also not so much about hypervisibility in this talk, just because we don't have enough time. But then I want to also come back to this issue of crisis, right? So this is the series is labor in the time of crises. And Jen started us off with a particular moment in our history, which is perhaps ongoing. It still continues to be a crisis for various reasons and for various people around the world. But this issue of COVID. So if we had the slides in front of with us, then you would see some images that I had put in the slides, which are images of deaths, COVID deaths in India. So I might be asking a lot of you so late in the day in terms of switching gears from US to India, but I will try and bring it back to sort of a global perspective, not just focused on India. But I'm going to start, or most of the conversation I'm going to present will be about India. So India, one of the, started off with a, very low rate of COVID deaths. And then in the second wave, what we were able to see is that the number of deaths, right? So there was some very visually arresting pictures of pyres and cremation and, burial grounds and, burial ground and cremation workers, breaking down because of both the sheer exhaustion of the work that they had to engage in, but also just because of the numbers of deaths, right? Contrary to official counts, the WHO has estimated 4.7 million deaths in India by 2021. So this is about 9.9 times greater than the official death rate. And the next slide, if you could see the slides, would have been images of the COVID-related migrant crisis that Charu mentioned. And those images were also pretty horrific. And so for those of us who were sitting in the US and North America and elsewhere, the Indian diaspora, it felt kind of, crushing, but also for people in India themselves, right? So there's an estimated about 100 million internal migrants. So these are often people migrating either from villages to cities or across villages, and they're looking for work. So there was a huge migrant crisis because work in the cities ceased to operate. There was a very strong lockdown that was imposed. And so these migrant workers typically tended to be, or continued to be, low-wage workers, just trying to make ends meet, sending money back, if possible, to their homes in the village. And I think we might be, okay, thank you, Charu. Okay, so here are the migrant, COVID-related migrant crisis, and they just didn't have jobs, right? And if they don't have a job and they weren't getting paid, it meant that they had to go back home because they couldn't afford to actually live in the city. And home, so part of the internal migration issue in India is that the entire families don't always migrate. You often have some people back in the villages or back in other places. So there was a home to go back to. If you could go to the next slide. So this. I want to then talk about this migrant related crisis, not just as a crisis of COVID, but it's really a crisis that was brought about by both the market and the state. And it was a crisis that preceded COVID. So here are some data, and I'm not going to share too much data, even though as economists, we often do, deal with numbers of some sort. But I just want to give you a sense of what has been happening in the Indian economy. And so most of these data for before 2022. So Indian economy, very high in terms of agriculture, right? So, for a long time, most employment was derived from agriculture, but it dropped quite sharply from 65% in 1993 to 42% in 2018-19. The problem is that most of these jobs that were lost by women, because in particularly in the in the 1990s and 2000s, women started to take on most of the agricultural jobs. So during this period 1993 to 2018-2019, overall jobs for men increased by 15.64 million. Whereas there was an overall decrease in jobs for women by 21.82 million. In other words, there were not enough jobs being created. So this is just for the people who are already employed. But every year you have new working age men and new working age women who are looking for jobs. So, in terms of men, there's a shortfall. And in terms of women, there's a shortfall of 116%, which means that the entire new bunch of working age women just don't have jobs, plus the ones who were working before have lost jobs, right? And so most of this job loss is focused in the informal economy. And the informal economy, for those of you who don't know, is basically that portion of the economy that's not necessarily regulated or, not always regulated by the state, but also does not have or usually is associated with very low levels of benefits, etc. So, not enough job security, but no benefits either, right? So the desire both in the US, but elsewhere has been for formal employment, but for formal employment in India is very, very, or the proportion of total employment is very, very dismal. So it was about 10% in 2012, and it was about 16% in 2018. Now, there's a lot more that I can talk about in terms of the Indian economy, but the idea that I want to present to you is that the Indian economy has not been job creating, right? And Kannan and Ravindran, who are, who've written a lot about this, they characterize this as a job loss economy. So you have very high levels of economic growth, but not enough job creation, particularly for women, right? So this situation before the pandemic continued even during the pandemic. And what we experienced was a very high loss of jobs. If you could move to the next slide. If you can think of the situation in the Indian economy, we have both a failure of the market. It just cannot or has not been able to create enough jobs, but it's also a failure of the state, because both as a COVID-related crisis, but also as a crisis in general, because what is the role of the state, or what role can the state play? It can, one, legislate wages and work conditions. It can direct the economy towards some, economic growth path of income and employment. It can provide a safety net, or it can ensure sufficient means of production and reproduction. And the Indian state has been unable to do this both before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and whatever condition we're calling us at this moment, right? So it just has not been able to provide sufficiently for particularly the working classes, which are quite varied and heterogeneous, and again don't really have time to get into it. So Charu, if you can move 2 slides down. So how have the Indian populations been able to survive, if at all they have been able to survive? Because remember, about 4.7 million actually died during COVID. But how the migrant workers who did go back, like how did they survive, right? So a very high proportion of them survived because of the women in the household who engaged either in agricultural work or some form of low-wage work in rural areas. I know that in your class you've studied about the domestic labor debates, debates in the 1960s by Maria Della Costa, Silvia Federici, etc. Where they talked about how capitalism depends on domestic labor. And then in the 1980s, Maria Mies and many others also talked about this in the context of the global South, talking about how in the global South, apart from what in the global North, we think of domestic labor, which is care labor, cooking, cleaning, taking care of the kids and elderly and all of that. You also have a very high proportion of women engaged in subsistence production, that is production for own consumption. And that continues to be the case. And so, capitalism then depends on the work that women end up doing in the household, whether that is, and we can talk of all of it as care labor, but essentially invisible production of goods. That could be food, that could be, collecting firewood, that could be collecting water, but also invisible production of services, all the services that we rely on in order to ensure that, one, that we are raised and we become adults, but then even as adults, we all need care of some sort, whether that care is provided by people at home, whether that care is provided by in the market, and Jen talked about all of the paid care work that women engage in the marketplace, or whether that's care provided by the community. So as much as capitalism depends on domestic and reproductive labor, life in general also depends on domestic and reproductive labor. And particularly in the Indian case, during the COVID crisis, it became quite crucial. But if you could move to the next slide, Charu. But how do official data obscure this kind of reproductive labor? So the table actually shows, so if you just look at that first column, those are all of the different ways in which people are categorized based on their work. And the next 2 columns give you share of men and share of women. And you'll find that the row that I have highlighted in red essentially says that 72% of women just don't have any category, right? So these are women who are completely excluded from any kind of official data, and hence any kind of conversation about how the economy might affect them, how they impact the economy, what kinds of policies might be good to put in place so that they are taken care of, and in what ways do this 72% of the women, in what ways do they actually contribute to the economy itself? So if you could move to the next slide. So in this paper that is co-authored with Smriti Rao, and Smriti will speak in one of the later sessions, we use the Indian time use survey, and I know that you are looking at the American time use survey in your class. And essentially a time use survey looks at how people engage in or what kinds of activities people engage in during the day, and based on that you can kind of get a sense of not just kind of how do people spend their time, right? So essentially that's what it is. The Indian time use survey of 2019 is significant because it's the first time use survey that was national time use survey that was collected in India. And in terms of, I have this thing called labor processes. Based on the work or based on all of the activities people are engaged in, we can classify sort of labor into casual wage work, that is you are not your regular 9-to-5 jobs, or you can talk about salaried wage labor, or you can talk about non-wage labor, which is just for the sake of just to make it simple, I'm just going to call it self-employment, though there is a little bit more to that, right? So those are market related jobs. And then labor for own production could be anything like sewing for your family, or it could be producing food for your family in your kitchen garden or your little farm, or collecting water or collecting firewood, or collecting forest products. And then unpaid care work is all of the care labor that goes into taking care of someone when they're ill or raising children. And unpaid domestic labor is all the cooking and cleaning and all of the production that is required in order to run a household. Charu, next slide. So essentially what we did was, and I'm not going to go through that table, what we did was we said, look, how about we look at these categories that the official data use, which is looking at workers based on how they're employed, and look at using time use, look at what kinds of activities or labor processes they're actually involved in. So it's basically a table which allows you to look at the distribution of time for any person who's categorized in a certain way. And apart from, so I'm just going to very quickly sort of highlight, what we found is that, particularly for the women who are in the undefined, who don't have any category, right? Their participation in own goods production, domestic work, and care work is extremely high. So they are contributing to, what people consume, what they are producing. They do contribute both in terms of production of goods and services, but they are just not counted in official data. And even those who are officially counted, because they have, they do engage in work that is considered work, a significant portion engages in this non-market production of goods and services. And there's also a high degree of livelihood diversification. So someone who is a salaried worker may actually not just be doing their 9-to-5 jobs, but they're also doing lots of other activities which go into the well-being of the household, well-being of the community, and so on. Charu, next slide. So we did this both for men and women. And what we found was that, in the previous slide, I talked about women, but what we found was that even for men, there's a very high degree of livelihood diversification. In other words, someone who's categorized as an agricultural wage worker may be engaged in other activities. And someone who may be, and not just agricultural wage work, someone who's categorized as salaried worker may also be engaged in other kinds of labor activities, all which go to talk about how diverse these livelihoods are. And there's a whole debate about in one of our other papers that my other papers co-authored with Lynn Osome, we've talked about how this actually is not something desirable. It's really, indicative of sort of immiserating conditions in India. The thing that I want to mention, though, is that official data say nothing about men's participation in unpaid care and domestic work. But time use data allows us to see that actually men do participate. And so, this obscuring of the ways in which even men engage in this kind of care work or domestic labor, it replicates a gendered ideology of, men are not the ones who engage in this work and only women do. It is true that women spend a lot more time, but it is also true that men do spend some time, and that we need to also allow for men to engage in some of this work. And so how do we kind of question this sort of gendered ideology, which gets kind of reinforced by the data and statistics as well? Charu, next slide. So I want to come back to this notion of what counts as a crisis. So Jen talked about the COVID crisis. I started off with COVID crisis, and how do we think about a crisis? Like, what constitutes a crisis? Is it a crisis only because it's a crisis for capitalism? Companies are unable to make profits, they're unable to kind of function, or can we also think about crises of social reproduction where people are unable to kind of survive, right? So I want to talk just very quickly about this another paper that I co-authored with Lynn Osome, where we compared labor force participation in India with labor force participation in South Africa. And the argument that we make there is that in India, you see a declining labor force participation, whereas in South Africa, you see increasing labor force participation. But the argument we make is that that in both cases, they are responses to crises, that women are engaging in either, because even as even as Indian women are withdrawing from the labor force, they are very high, there is a very high rate of participation in production for the household, which is not counted. So women, whether in South Africa or India, are not withdrawing their labor and sitting at home and watching TV. They are actually engaged in backbreaking work. Either, some of this work is paid, some of it is unpaid, but in both cases, they are responding to a crisis of consumption, a crisis of sort of survival, crisis that the household and the community is facing. So this crisis of social reproduction, it is systemic. We recognize it as a crisis when there are, recessions, or when there is, a health crisis like the pandemic. However, there is this crisis of social reproduction that a lot of people across the world, both in the global South, but also the global North, continue to face. And that even though I didn't have time to talk about all the different ways that we can think about, race and gender, and in the Indian context, caste, that this crisis tends to be concentrated in certain marginalized communities, and that the labor that they provide, the labor that's non-waged and invisible to official data and policymakers and public discourses, tends to be the ultimate safety net for the most marginalized communities across the world. And that what we observe from India or Southern Africa, where I've done work with Lynn as well, is that that there is this that women, because of the historical role that they've played, increasingly bear this burden of social reproduction, what Silvia Federici has referred to as a permanent reproductive crisis. So I'm just going to end with this final slide. I know we're sort of heavily out of time. So I want to end with sort of what Drew Barker, right, who we are, we've dedicated the series to, so one of the things that Drew talked about in her various works is about the material and ideological relations of gender and of economics, and how in to take cognizance of that means that you also have to interrogate race and class and culture and other forms of marginalization. And in the Indian context, you would also talk about caste. So we have to then interrogate how these statistics, first, what counts as data and what counts as statistics and what counts as numbers, but that when we are given those numbers and data and statistics, that they're not objective, right? The story that they tell itself is a story that we have to recognize the ideological framework within which they are collected. So that is a very important aspect of, for anyone who is looking at that, at statistics and numbers and data, including economists, right? So when we talk about, making invisible, in the context of India, but also in other countries as well, this invisible labor of reproduction, so when we make that invisible, what does that do? It kind of minimizes the extent of our recognition of the extent of the crisis of reproduction, and often borne by working classes who are gendered, racialized, and caste-based, but it also kind of minimizes the extent that people are pushing themselves, right? So Jason Moore has talked about exhaustion of the working classes. In what ways are the working classes, particularly those who are feminized and who kind of provide that safety net, in what ways are they pushing themselves in order to just survive, or in order to kind of reach the level of reach the minimum standard of living that is considered acceptable within society? And so we need to think about the politics of visibility and invisibility in that sense. And I'm sorry that we have run out of time and I have no time to talk about hypervisibility, but if at all there are any questions, we can address them there.
I'm so okay. So much going on. So delighted. Let me change the view. So hopefully the view will fix itself in a minute. But Sirisha, Jennifer, thank you so much. This was so rich. And I'm sure not just me, my students and everybody here was excited to hear this, right? I mean, we heard about questions of health, questions of COVID, both in relation to the specific crisis, but also in relation to how do we think about what's a crisis, what's not? Why is this considered a crisis? Why not? From Jennifer, and also Sirisha from you, where you reminded us that what's considered a crisis is often only what's visible in the politics of visibility and invisibility. But there's a deep structure behind what's counted, what's not counted. How do we interpret data? How do we handle issues? So with those said, I have so much, but we are not doing time. So I'm going to let my students get their moment. So, oh my God, so many questions. All right, I have to curate this. Thank you. 2 minutes. Just so many questions. Sorry. Oh, wow. Oh my God. All right. I'm going to start naming these. First, I just want to acknowledge Manar Chabo. You're one of the students of True. I just want to acknowledge you. because yeah, you and me, one of the women who taught me gender studies, supervised me, cared for me. So I don't want to diminish that. I just wanted to mean that. A lot of the comments are, yeah. Jennifer, for you. Can a capitalist system proactively regulate markets? Because your critique is about capitalism. So this is for you, Jennifer. Is there a way in which regulation can work to handle exploitation and price gouging and supply? Or are they just inherently not capable?
I was looking at a similar question in the responses. I think the real answer to that is the profit motive is the engine of capitalism, and regulating the profit motive is not something that states do. So, but the regulation would have to come through, labor standards. But the better way to get regulation imposed would be through labor unions, would be through a collective of workers exercising power. So I guess my answer to that is really that capitalism itself operates on the profit motive, and if we're not going to get rid of the profit motive, it's going to be really hard to do anything about that. There are countries that do a better job with supporting social reproduction, right? So that's another option. It doesn't take away exploitation, though, right? I mean, that doesn't change the conditions of exploitation. It just makes it easier for people to reproduce themselves or less painful. And the US is obviously especially harsh in that respect among developed countries, especially.
Can I add to that? Part of what your talk described is something I've been thinking about, partly because my book was about that. Early work, Truth in Advertising, I worked on this. This is my book, Structuralism and Individualism in Economic Analysis. This was about exchange rates, not about COVID. But one of the questions I want to follow up on that around the profit motive is something you mentioned, which is the figure of the entrepreneur, right? I'm in Seattle. We're all here. I've got like colleagues in other schools who do entrepreneur development, business entrepreneurship, right? And I'm wondering about what you pointed out, which is there's a masculinity for the entrepreneur, and B, how do I put this? We spend our life, right? It's like a romance novel. You're waiting for the guy to offer to you. You're waiting to be wooed by the great lover, right? That's the entrepreneur. You're just waiting for Bezos to love on you. I'm from Seattle. You're just waiting for Gates to desire on you, right? The whole language is so emasculine. You keep like doing what you have to do for them to love on you. They're the entrepreneur. But it's emasculine. But B, I think what you were pointing out, it's undemocratic, right? we should not do our policy waiting to woo and love on and hope for all these entrepreneurial masculine guys to love us, when the actual labor is done by women, right? So there's a gender in both ways. So most people think of what you pointed out, the gender of work and exploitation, which is women do the work. But you also had a point, which is the gender of the entrepreneur. And I think that's worth pursuing. So I'd love to hear from you on that.
So one of the things that I didn't talk about that's in there that I think is a really important aspect of that is how extractive the entrepreneur is. And I mean, you can see it empirically, you know, looking at like the PPE kind of stuff, where it's a transfer of value. When you look, it doesn't even need to be PPE. When you look at the hoarder price gouger thing, it's transferring value from women to men, because women are typically the people who are purchasing those kinds of inputs to health for themselves and for their households and for their paid work. In some cases, where nurses were buying, certainly during the pandemic, were buying their own inputs to health. So, you know, it's extractive. That's one of the things that's interesting about looking at that, the sphere of circulation, or thinking about it in consumption, is that the extraction is already happening through work. When you're working for an entrepreneur, right? It's already happening through capital and production. But the additional extraction is that, you know, what people are calling profiteering, which is still really just profiting, it's like a second layer of that. So it's like doubly extractive from women, and the transfer of value is going from women to men in both cases. So there's something to that I think is just, I mean, immediately repugnant, but is a really powerful mechanism through which patriarchy is operating in invisible ways. So I think that is definitely a piece of that is pretty key. But, you know, the massification of entrepreneurship, like courses and teaching students to be entrepreneurial and all of that, I mean, you know, all of that is around that kind of ideology and about maintaining that power relation, basically, you know, maintaining some kind of mythology around that. So it's extractive in a couple of different ways, but that transfer of value is one of them that I find really intriguing, because it's outside of paid work, but it's through disposable income then. So, and that's definitely
I just wanted to name, I just wanted to name, so much work has been done on women's unpaid, underpaid, undervalued labor. Not enough people pay attention to men's overpaid, overvalued labor, right?
Exactly.
It's only one directional. And this question of the entrepreneur is, the question is why? It's not just why are women underpaid. It's like, why is this guy paid so much? We can't even decide if we hate him or love him, right? That was your example, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, what's going on? So I think what you're pointing out is gender is two-way. It's not just feminine,
Absolutely.
It's masculine. And the opposite of the caring woman is the entrepreneurial man.
And the dynamic between them is about visibility.
Yeah,
right?
It is totally.
It's the invisibilization when you have that mythology, and it just eliminates women and women's work entirely. I thought about this recently, and I've been thinking about it in terms of the ways that often my students will talk about people being underprivileged, but no one will talk about being overprivileged.
Yeah.
But, you know, if everyone were equally privileged, it would just be equality.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and it is, I think that what you're pointing to is actually something Drew would like, But what is actually key to gender? Gender is not just feminine, it's both masculine and feminine. And so the opposite of women's underprivilege is men's overprivilege, right? So you have
Yeah,
to look
I
at
always
both
push
sides.
for relationality to be like a central thing. I mean, it's so important to recognize that we're not just talking about women, we're not just talking about underprivilege. I mean, if we're talking about equity, then we have to be thinking about those things in a relational way, and it's a dynamic relationship, right? And the dynamism
So
is something that's beneficial.
I'm not going to add this because we've already addressed this, but one of my student questions, was for folks who are joining us, this is part of the class. One of my students' questions was, don't men do more hard labor, face more danger, deserve more pay because they're doing more difficult work? And this is a data class, gender and the politics of numbers. So my immediate question was, what's your data, right? Where do you go? How did you decide whose labor was more or less difficult? But more crucially, the reason the student asked this question is we live in a world, right, where certain kinds of jobs, being a fireman, being a cop, is viewed as dangerous, even though both you and I know the data shows that's not the high risk. But they don't view being a healthcare person who's going to die from COVID as a dangerous job, right? So when you want to ask yourself, where is danger? What is understood as danger? What you're doing with healthcare, it's one of the most dangerous professions. And we got the data show this, but we don't have the culture to recognize that. I'm going to keep looking at the chat. Looking forward, I have another question. This is for Sirisha. Sirisha, one of the questions was that there was a real interest in realizing that beyond the US, there were actual policies that other third world countries had, right? Most people think like only the US has policies, nobody else has policies and so on. So listening to your talk, but also reading your readings, even though it was about the inadequacy of some of them, it was really interesting for students to hear that there was actually a bunch of efforts for measurement and policy for agricultural women in the informal sector. So they wanted to hear more about that, because usually you just hear about Swedish models or welfare or whatever. You never really hear about third world models. And so this was a question. And then there was a question about what could we do to learn more from that and spread it. Sirisha?
So one of the things that I want to mention is that thus far, or at least, until the last 4 years or so, at least, statistical data collection, very, very sophisticated in India. Some of the, when it was set up, the Official Data Collection Agency in 1950s, these were people who were also influencing the way data collection was being thought about across the world. One sophisticated way in which, for instance, may not actually be applicable to the US, but definitely very relevant to countries like India, is, for instance, collecting data on work that is in the informal sector. So these are informal employees who don't show up on payrolls. These are workers who are working in agricultural farms and don't again show up on payrolls in the ways that people show up in the US. And so there's actually a pretty extensive data collection. Unfortunately, it doesn't extend to collecting data on all forms of reproductive labor, whether they are carried out by men or women. So that's about data collection. So one of the, and I suspect that people are talking about, for instance, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which is a full employment measure, which people in the US have been talking about, and it was implemented in about 2003 or 4 in India, only for rural areas. And it's essentially work on demand. So you're guaranteed 100 days of work if you demand